Hey, Daniel, thank you so much for such a warm and thoughtful introduction. It's so good to be here with all of you today. So many friends out there. As Daniel mentioned, I have a very direct connection to education in Louisiana. My first job when I got my teacher credential was teaching high school civics and social studies at Scotlandville Magnet High School in East Baton Rouge Parish. So my relationship with Louisiana education goes back 30 years to my first job in the field. What I want to talk with you guys about today, you're going to hear from a bunch of thoughtful, really smart people talking with you today about school choice, how to design choice plans, strategies, how to make sure we spend dollars more effectively. And that's great. I want to touch on something that sets up that conversation a little bit by way of starting the day. And that's that one of my great frustrations through a couple decades of being at this work now is that efforts to reform and reinvent American education keep coming across as a tax on public education, as a tax on public educators. This has been destructive for efforts to dramatically improve education delivered to our kids. It has caused good and thoughtful efforts to encounter barriers they didn't need to encounter. And it has made all of this work both more small-minded and more of a slog than I think education reinvention really should be. So when we talk a lot about how to make sure people understand reform, we tend to talk about messaging. We've got to do a better job messaging that this is about the kids, not adult interest. And I'm sure that's part of it, but I'm not a message guy. For me, the fundamental issue here is really one of thinking. How do we think and understand the work of school improvement? And I think what happens is we have gotten stuck so much in the now. We've gotten stuck so much in some of our frustrations with the world as it stands and with public schools as we're used to them, that we have allowed that to become the way we think and talk about what public education is and should be. So if you don't like the look of government-run buildings right now working on the convenience of district employees, we then come across as somehow anti the project of public education. And that obviously gets it all wrong. So the trick is, how do we get out of that? How do we not allow the narrative just to be, this is public education, and you're either for it or you're against it? And I think the answer is we got to stretch our perspective. I think if we rewind the clock a couple hundred years and think about how we got to where we are today, what I have found over time is it's enormously helpful on two counts. One, it's helpful in terms of us understanding and being able to explain what public education is and isn't. And the second thing is I think it actually turns out to be really helpful in terms of thinking more creatively about the kinds of solutions we're going to put forward. Now, if we were all together doing this thing, what I would do is I would throw out a few questions. We would be tackling this as a quiz. There's great blessings with doing some of this stuff online. In fact, that it's easier to kind of connect, but there's also limitations. What I am going to do, though, is I'm going to throw out 5 questions real quick to all of you. And what I love is if you would just take half a second, jot down your best guess response to the 5, and then we're going to work through them. This is an educational technique known as Velcro. Turns out that if you ask somebody a question on the front end, they get more curious in the answer than they might have been if you just tell them the answer off the bat. 5 questions. 1, what year was the first law providing for public provision of education in what's now the United States? Question 2, 2 centuries ago, in 1810, what percentage of the nation's teachers were women? Question 3, a little over a century ago, in 1900, what percentage of 18-year-olds were graduating high school? Question 4, in 1930, say at the end of the booming 20s, where did the US rank internationally in reading and math performance? And question 5, in 1990, what percentage of America's schools were hooked into the internet? All right. If you knew none of the answers, that's totally cool. You're not supposed to know this stuff. And if you did know the answers, terrific. Let's walk through the questions I just asked. When was the first law providing for public education in what's now the United States? There's actually three acceptable answers. There were three bills passed in Massachusetts Bay Colony back in the 1640s: 1642, 47, 48. I might be off by a year. Sometimes I forget things. These were known as the Old Deluder Satan Acts. Why did Massachusetts provide for public education? Those of you who remember your kind of ancient history, have read the Crucible, will remember. Massachusetts Bay Colony had a witch problem. They were worried that witches were out there corrupting their youth and turning them down the dark path. So in order to make sure that kids couldn't be tricked by witches into becoming Satan worshipers, they wanted to make sure the kids could read, so they could read the Bible, so they would not be fooled by that old deluder Satan, hence the Old Deluder Satan Acts. This was highly successful. You go up to Massachusetts today, you hardly ever encounter a witch, right? Massachusetts textbooks, this is known as the No Witch Left Behind law. All right, bad joke, especially in this form, where you can't actually laugh out loud. Basic point is what schools were started to do in the 1640s in Massachusetts, where Massachusetts required that every town with 100 families or more erect a school to make sure that those kids could read, so they'd read the Bible. Very different mission and purpose from what we ask our schools today, what our schools to do today. 1810, what percentage of teachers were women? Turns out it was about 10%. 90% of the nation's teachers were men. In fact, back in the early 1800s, it was thought to be inappropriate for women to engage with other people's children outside their home. It was thought to be immoral, especially if a woman might be pregnant. It was thought to be non-hygienic. In fact, the only teaching that women tended to do in the colonial era was what they called dame schools, where women would have other people bring their children to their house, kind of an at-home pre-K daycare. What happened? Well, men turned out to be more expensive because you had to pay them a competitive wage. Women were cheap. And men only taught for a year or two. This was something men did who didn't get the farm or didn't get the family business before they went off and tried to find a plot of land. So when a guy named Horace Mann came along in the 1830s in Massachusetts and took over the State Board of Education and wanted to build out a common school system that would expand educational provision to make sure that this influx of Catholics was learning to read the right Bible, the Protestant Bible, the King James Bible, he needed to run schools several months a year with predictable labor that wasn't going anywhere. So what happened was they decided that teaching could be women's work if these women were trained by men in the norms of engaging with kids. They started special colleges to teach women the norms of engaging with kids. They called them normal schools. That's today's teacher colleges. This is how they started. And the great thing from Horace Mann's perspective was they could pay women teachers a third of what they were paying their male counterparts, and they weren't going to go anywhere because there were no alternative jobs. By the late 1800s, by 1870, teaching was 75, 80% women. And this was true until well into the middle of the 20th century. In the 1950s, over half of college-educated women still became teachers. Doors to other professions were closed. So when you think about how we staff schools, how we recruit teachers at 22 and hope they're going to do the job for the next 30 years, today into the 2050s, these were all rhythms and assumptions built over more than a century in a labor force where women didn't have other options. It was a model that worked okay for them back then. The huge problem for us today is those women who used to become teachers are now becoming accountants, astrophysicists, everything under the sun. Today, only about 15% of women with college degrees become teachers. Our labor force has dried up. Question 3, in 1900, what percentage of 18-year-olds were finishing high school? It was only about 6%, about 1 out of 16. When you talk about how well we're doing today, it's important to understand that when we think about the average high school graduate of a century ago, this was 1 out of 16 students. If you choose the top 1/16th in any state today, the numbers tend to look a lot better than if you look for all of the children who we need to graduate. Now, look, it didn't matter if you graduated high school in 1900 because 80% of jobs were in farms and factories. You didn't need a diploma. Heck, most of them, you didn't need a sixth grade education. The world of work looks very different today, and opportunities are restricted by education today in a way they once weren't. High school graduation did not become a norm in this country really until about after World War II. So we spent from 1640s till the 1940s, 300 years, just trying to get to the point where half of our kids would graduate high school. Trying to figure out how do you actually then retool this for a world where everybody's getting educated has been the project of maybe 2 generations or 3. We've got a long way to go on it. And maybe we need some thinking that's a little different than a lot of our improvement efforts to date. Question 4. In 1930, where did the US rank internationally in reading and math scores? Now, if you go online, you will find all kinds of charts which show that we were number 1. This is fake news. There were no international tests in 1920 or 1930 or 1940 or 1950. Nothing like this existed really at scale until the 1990s, when International Consortia launched TIMSS and PISA. So when you hear about how good or bad we might have been a century ago, this is conjecture. The reality is we just don't know. Question 5. What percentage of schools were hooked up to the internet in 1990? If we'd been hit by COVID in 1990, what percent of schools could have actually delivered any kind of remote learning? The answer, 0%. None. Internet as we know it was barely being born at that point. Schools weren't really being connected until well into the 1990s. What's the point of this little soliloquy? Well, for me, the point, there's three key points that I think it's really useful to keep in mind. One, the purpose of what schools are for has changed profoundly over time. They used to be about making sure kids were literate enough to read the Bible. Today, it's about taking every single child in the state of Louisiana and making sure they have the skills, the knowledge, the tools, the capacities that let them pursue their dreams into the worlds of college or work or wherever they take them. Second thing that's changed profoundly is the people who do the work of educating. The educational workforce that our schools were built around was a captive labor force of women who had other doors closed to them. So they would work at discounted wages. We didn't have to compete for talent. And benefits made it should be tooled for somebody who's going to do the same job for 30 years, just like hiring and HR should be built around trying to recruit somebody at age 22 to do the same job for the next 30 years. None of those assumptions hold today. When we think about how do we make sure we get the instructional talent we need to serve our kids well, we need to separate ourselves from things that may have made a lot of sense in 1935 or 1965 and ask what's going to make sense in 2025. And the third thing that's changed in a phenomenal way are the tools at our disposal. When I taught high school 30 years ago, if you wanted to tutor a kid, you drove to their house. If you wanted to talk to a parent, you tried to reach them on their yellow telephone mounted on the kitchen wall and hope that you got them because not everybody had an answering machine. Today, our tools for communication, for instruction, for assessment, for support are fundamentally different than they've ever been, which suggests to me that we need to fundamentally rethink how we go about the work of schooling. So let me wrap this up, and then Daniel, maybe you can hop on and we can talk about all this a little bit and maybe take some questions from the folks with us today. But for me, the bottom line is Louisiana has done some really inspiring work over the last couple decades. I think so much of what played out post-Katrina in New Orleans has been studied assiduously around the country because it teaches us so much about how things can change. But I think the right lesson here is to understand that we need to rethink, reimagine, think of new structures, new models, new ways of letting families find the right school for their kid, new ways of hiring the staff who are going to provide the support and instruction kids need, new ways of leveraging the tools at our disposal. The wrong response, I think, is to say, oh, all right, somebody solved this. All we need to do is tell people that, that public schools are failing, they should sign up for this. Because not only do I think it's not the right way to think about solving the problems, but we've also got 30 years of evidence that sales pitch doesn't actually help parents or communities understand why they should be excited about the kinds of rethinking we're proposing. With that, let me wrap it up.
Great stuff, as always, Rick. Thank you so much for your insights. And, I think sometimes at these we just hear, and look, there, as you know, some of the what I'll call same old solutions are really important and things that need to be done. But if we're really going to make this better over the long term, we've got to think bigger and look ahead and look around the corner. So grateful for your challenge to do that. So first of all, I'd like to note I was on the phone during your presentation looking for a bill sponsor for the No Witch Left Behind Act. So we'll be getting that moving here in Louisiana, no problem. Learning from the past, right? I have some questions from the audience. I want to start one. You addressed a lot of it sort of at the end of your remarks, but I sort of sense a tinge of maybe friendly criticism in sort of our traditional approaches to school choice and changes, and how do we think about these reforms differently? Can you expand on that just a little bit more? What can we learn as advocates that help us get over that hump a little better and start to think along the lines that you're suggesting?
Sure. It's such a great question. And I think that's right. One of the things is those of us who believe in school choice and embrace school choice often get defensive with good reason. We've taken so many cheap shots and slings and arrows from union leaders and ed school types over the years that, we can get thin-skinned. And look, I mean, it's human. But I think one of the problems is it has sometimes caused us not to be our sharpest, not to bring our best arguments to the table, not to be as creative as we might be. So two particular ways of thinking about, kind of friendly suggestions here. One is that a lot of the conversation about school choice over time has been, does it work? That school choice, here's evidence that school choice works. And that's tricky, I think, because one, it forces us to play by the scorecard of the folks defending the status quo. We say, look, your test scores aren't, then they say, all right, you better bring door-knocking test scores. And of course, part of the logic of choice is it's not all about removing reading and math scores, especially on state tests. It's about making sure that families can find the school that's right for their child. That might be about social emotional needs. It might be about artistic temperament. It might be about they want civics that values American history. Personal response. And so when we wind up playing by these other metrics, we wind up getting hemmed in. The other part of that, of the it works mantra that's wrong, is it trips us up. When you talk, I work at AEI, American Enterprise Institute, where we've got phenomenal thinkers on a range of issues, a bunch of which deal with questions of regulation. And when you think about people who have studied telecommunications deregulation or trucking deregulation, the argument is not usually it works. The argument is there's better and worse ways to do it. If you deregulate telecommunications, but you do it in a way that you let apex predators slam the door on startups, that's not good competition. So when we talk about whether choice works, whether competition works, usually those of us who believe in markets are really interested in what are market designs that create more vibrant, solution-oriented markets. And when you just say it works, you kind of take yourself out of that conversation because anything else becomes a criticism. The second place, so on that side of it, I would just say, look, we ought to say not choice is good because the choice works, but choice helps meet needs. There's lots of needs it meets. We ought to document these. We ought to show evidence of these. But when somebody says it doesn't work, we ought to say, well, define work. If thousands of families feel their kids are safer, are better educated, we can show evidence that their kids are learning in a variety of ways. What about that doesn't work? That seems to me truer to the spirit of the work we're doing. The second place where I think we get stuck a little bit is out of political exigency, we wind up talking about school choice. You need to be able to move your kid out of this awful, unsafe school to that school. And absolutely. The problem is that most American parents like their kids' school. 80% of parents tend to give their kids school an A or a B, no matter how they feel about the nation's schools. And as we all know, affluent parents tend to have a lot of choice already that's baked in. When they buy a house, they look for a good school. If they're frustrated, they move their kid to a private school. And it's affluent parents who tend to vote at high rates, tend to be highly active in politics. So if the entire choice coalition is just about the 1/5 of families who are least empowered, who are most angry, and only about 24% of American households have a school-age kid at home, basically 1/5 of that is about 5% of voting families. That is not a winning coalition. And you're not really grabbing all the potential of choice, because the great thing about choice is even if you like your kid's school, you can be frustrated as heck that they're not able to get advanced placement options in science or math. You can be frustrated as heck with the way their teacher is approaching American history or civics education. You can be. We want to have a choice coalition, I think, that invites all these people in, that says whatever your frustration, whether it's an unsafe school that you got to get your kid out of, we've got your back. But also, if you like your school, but other things are frustrating you, we've got you. And that's why, like, Louisiana's course choice program is so promising. That's why education savings accounts, I think, are so appealing. One of the problems, though, is a lot of folks who like charter schools, especially my friends who tend to be on the political left, say, well, we're for charters, but all that other stuff is too radical. And I think too often as a coalition, we've said, all right, well, we'll make our peace with that. And I think it's important that sometimes you have to make tactical compromises. That's fine. That's life in a free country. But the choice community as a whole needs always to be explaining why that kind of compromise is leaving far too many people outside looking in.
Oh, man, that is terrific. I love that. And that's, certainly rings true here in Louisiana as we think about the Choice Coalition and how we're going to get this done in the next couple of years. That's terrific. Let me start with some questions we've gotten from listeners. So, and you may be uniquely positioned given your book and the work that you've been doing to write that. What's a common misconception that you hear from opponents of reform that we ought to be mindful of as we're doing our work?
That's such a great question. So partly, honestly, I mean, we define reform in very different ways. There's a lot of people in Washington, D.C. right now who will tell me that the $129 billion we're borrowing from our kids to shovel into public education is reform. The fact of putting this money out is I don't think so.
Yeah.
During the Obama years, reform frequently got defined as aggressive micromanagement by, people who wanted to tell schools exactly the right ratio of reading and math test scores to use. Well, for me, the right way to think about this is what I usually call big R versus little r reform. I got into this in a book I wrote a few years ago called Letters to a Young Education Reformer. For me, big R reform are when we fall in love with these capital letter solutions that work really well for those of us who spend our time in the Beltway or like work in the world of policy and philanthropy. No Child Left Behind, Common Core, school improvement grants, race to the top. We get very excited in the Beltway about these kinds of things. The problem is, as some of the tee up you guys shared with the education stuff, those great videos, kids are different, communities are different, schools are different. We've got 50-odd million children in 100,000 schools across this country. It turns out to be enormously hard to come up with a solution in Washington or state capital. So I tend to be a little R reform guy. I tend to be interested in how do you create room for educators and communities and families to find solutions that work for them. So I love learning pods. I love hybrid homeschooling. I love school districts that say, look, here's what we're doing to deliver remote learning, but we want to create lots of avenues for educators and families to also figure out if this doesn't work for them, make sure they have that chance. So what I think opponents what opponents of reform get right sometimes is that some of the reforms we put forward actually are just a different spin on this one system that we've grown used to knowing. What I think opponents of reform get wrong most frequently is a lot of their opposition comes from folks who are deeply invested in parts of the status quo. Your teachers who have pensions and you're worried about what's going to happen to your pension. Your families who've worked hard and played by the rules to buy into a suburban neighborhood. And now they hear these radicals want to blow up zip code education. And they're worried that their kid's going to have to ride a bus 90 minutes to find a decent school. And I think the way we defang some of those criticisms, there's going to be people who are just honestly self-interested, and that's how the world works. But the people who I think are legitimately nervous about what we're talking about, the more we explain the rationale behind it, the more we talk about, hey, well, here's what we're trying to do. We're open to better ways to do it. We want to rethink teacher pay. That doesn't mean we didn't change the pension rules on teachers who've been teaching for 10 years. When we did Social Security reform in the 1980s, what the Greenspan Commission did was they grandfathered folks who were close to retirement. They said, look, we got to change the rules, but we understand that if you're close to it, you've made a bunch of assumptions. So when we talk about changing pay, when we talk about changing funding streams, part of what we can do is if we show up and we're more interested in the result than in selling a particular bill, what it can give us is opportunities to start to peel off some of the people who have concerns, because they go, oh, all right, you answered my concern. I'm going to sit this one out. Too often, what we do is we fire back in a hurry. And what we do is rather than causing some of the folks on the other team to say, I'll sit this one out, we get them all as riled up as possible.
I think that's exactly right. You mentioned learning pods and some of these innovations. I'm a big fan as well. We had a question about what are the biggest lessons learned for you from, we're 1 year on from the beginning of the pandemic. What have we learned? And, what are the big takeaways?
Oh, man, there's so many. Let me hit three.
Sure.
One is that, I've got a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old. So, and as a teacher, the things that make teaching such a phenomenal job is the humanity of it, right? Going in and being with a bunch of 14 and 15-year-olds, for educators, this is, this is so much of the reward of the work. And yet, I think I was struck that I think even I have probably not paid as much attention to that over the last 25 years. That human dimension, it's just so easy to lose track of. We talk about performance metrics, reading and math scores. And look, I think what this reminds us is that so much of what schools are about is, especially for kids who don't have big families, for kids who don't have neighborhood outlets. For them, so much of this is about a place to be with their peers, get engagement that's not virtual, it's not social media. It's to find mentors. It's to actually have a supervised, safe environment. And it strikes me how often we've forgotten about that, I think, in some of the discourse. And I think, again, when we talk about school choice works in a sense because schools of choice tend to be great at those things. And we lose that when we start only talking about reading math scores. Second thing that I think we've got to pay a lot of attention to is how miserably public school systems tended to respond to the challenge. Not because they don't care about kids. What I'm talking about is the superintendent of Philadelphia, who I greatly admire, sent a letter instructing teachers in Philadelphia not to instruct kids, ultimately for 7 weeks, because they were worried about running afoul of federal law. Arlington, Virginia, where I live, dictated in late March, we're not teaching any new content this year because we don't want to run afoul of equity concerns under federal guidance. There were states that would not let families enroll their kids in virtual charter schools because they said, hey, you're not allowed to change out of your closed district to an operating school because we're worried about the impact on revenue. What's happened is, I think one of the things the pandemic has made brutally clear is that so many of these well-intentioned restrictions and laws where we understand the intent, but they get in the way of spending dollars smart for kids, of making staffing decisions smart for kids, these things tend to go under the radar. And the pandemic suddenly put them into stark focus. And we need to remember that. And we need to act on that. And the third thing is I think it's been a really useful lesson for people about the power of digital learning in two ways. One, that digital remote learning is a hugely powerful tool. It can do amazing things. It can extend the reach of instructors, make materials available in ways that simply was not possible 30 years ago, that was unimaginable for almost all of human history. The flip side is what good education is it's about the hand on the shoulder. It's about a teacher leaning in and explaining something. It's about a human connection that helps you see a possibility. Remote learning and technology in general, that's not what it's good at. So the right way to think about the power of tech is just like in every other field, it's hamburger helper. You shouldn't think about tech as a replacement or instead of. It should be a way for us to think about how do we have good teachers do much more of what good teachers do that makes a difference in children's lives? And how do we use the technology to augment and supplement and support them in ways that they're spending more time on the important, valuable stuff and less time on the routine, unimportant stuff?
Great stuff. Thank you. All right, now here's a good one. I like this came in. If you could wave a magic wand and change one thing in Louisiana, I guess we can open it up, but stay on education policy. However you want to interpret that question. What would it be? What would be the big change you would make?
So I think, an obvious answer here is give families much more ability to choose their school. Probably the simple answer is, look, let's just ESA the entire state education budget. $13 a kid, mail to the family. But at some level, I'm not even sure that's the most impactful answer for me. I mean, I think for me, the most impactful answer is what really matters in schools is what we just touched on. It's what adults do with kids. That's ultimately what education is about. And we have a model of teaching that has been baked in over 2 centuries for the reasons we just talked about, cheap labor force, blah, 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 which is basically committed to using talent in the least responsible possible manner. If you go into a school and you say to a principal, hey, can you point out your strongest 3rd grade reading teacher? Principal will take you and you'll watch the teacher teach, and she's teaching 26 kids reading for 90 minutes. And then she's teaching 26 kids math for 90 minutes. And then she's spending 45 minutes watching kids eat lunch. And then you say, hey, can you show me your least effective teacher? And you walk across the hall, and that teacher's teaching reading for 90 minutes and math for 90 minutes. And same thing, if you say, who's a teacher who's phenomenal with kids who are having a tough time at home? And that teacher's workday looks exactly like everybody else. It's just like if you worked into an architecture firm or a law firm or a hospital, and they said, hey, we've got 100 medical employees. Some of them are cardiovascular surgeons. Some of them are candy stripers. We ask them all to take time feeding Jell-O. We ask them all to take a turn at heart surgery. We just do whatever comes up on the wheel. My dream would be to see Louisiana rethink the state step-on-lane salary band, the baseline off which districts work. It would be to reinvent the job descriptions available. It would be to reinvent the licensure and certification process so that when you talk about teachers, there are teachers who make a phenomenal difference for kids. And there are job descriptions where they're 12-month-a-year employees making 135 grand, and they are working in roles where they're still in classrooms with kids, but in fundamentally reimagined routines. And they are working with teams of teachers. What's the right model for this? I don't know. But what I'd like if you went district to district across the state and you saw models that look a little bit more like what you see from one law firm to the next, or one dentist dental office or architecture practice to the next, rather than what we see today.
I love it. I love it. All right, we're going to do one more question, and then I will turn it over to you for any closing thoughts before we move on to our panel. So I like this question. I'm an optimist at heart. What do you see? You have a bird's eye view of things happening in DC and all across the country. What makes you the most hopeful as we look ahead to the future?
I think the pandemic is going to have a profound impact on how parents and communities think about schools. We've learned that we can't expect schools to be there just because they're government institutions. They will close the door at their convenience, and they will reopen at their convenience. And I think that has profoundly jarred huge numbers of people who just took it for granted. We know that some people, especially single parents who were essential workers, have been extraordinarily frustrated that they can't count on schools to be essential in the same ways. But we've also seen lots of parents who said, I love this. I love this kind of hybrid. I like having my kid here. I like the ways it's allowed me to be involved in my kid's education. And we also, Daniel, you talked about transparency, about spending at the beginning of our session. but also transparency into what actually happens in school. I can't tell you the number of people who've emailed me and said, I'm so confused. Dr. Hess, my kids at school 7 hours a day, but now suddenly, especially on asynchronous learning, it's like 55 minutes. Like, what have they been doing the other 6 hours? Or parents who said, my gosh, this looks so hard, and I am so impressed by what these teachers are doing and how they're doing it. Or conversely, teachers who are like, I can't believe what they're telling my kid in history class. I think, once you've spent a year going through this, I don't think it immediately or easily goes away. So, for me, I think the biggest change is there is now all of this potential and power in parents' hands, all this knowledge and insight and angst and frustration and hope. And I think a huge part of reform is, can we channel it in a way that doesn't feel like it's about our hobby horses, the things that like you and I and our friends have wanted to do forever? But can we make sure it feels to parents like we are fighting for changes that are responsive to the concerns they have coming out? And I think there's a lot of overlap. I think their concerns actually have an enormous amount of overlap with what we'd like to do. But I think we need to make sure we're talking about what they need rather than what we'd like to do.
Oh, so great. I love it. All right. Close us out, Dr. Hess. Preach the good word. What's your charge for everyone, lawmakers, voters, citizens, people who care about this a lot? Give us your closing thoughts.
The first thing is, look, I think you guys are in for a treat today. Dan, you've got a bunch of smart people coming on to talk about the ins and outs of this. But the bigger picture here is, let's remember, we talk a lot about who's for the kids. And look, the beautiful thing about a free country is we're going to disagree about what's for the kids. We're supposed to disagree about what's for the kids. But at the end of the day, it's hard to think of anything, of all of the challenges we have as a nation, especially in the midst of a pandemic, coming out of a pandemic. All of the challenges we have, it's hard to think of anything that ought to be near and dear to our hearts than education. This is about who we want to be. It's about the kinds of people we want our children to grow up to be. It's about teaching them the kind of country we want them to live in. It's about sharing the values and the history that we hold dear. And so anytime we feel ourselves getting pulled in one of these conversations into something that feels like it's just about test scores or spending or regulatory, we've got to always kind of remember that at the end of this, the way it's going to be experienced by families and kids and communities and educators is, at the end of the day, is this profoundly personal experience. And we've got to make sure we keep that in mind so that we explain it that way, so that we defend it that way, and so that we're thinking that way. It's been a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for having me, my friend.
Great to be with you again, and hopefully soon we can have you with us in person again soon, and you can go revisit some of your old stomping grounds here in Louisiana.
I'd enjoy that.
Thank you so much.